to share with you today. And I'll present the results. If you do have questions, if you could just jot those down, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So, just to begin, I'd like to provide a little bit of context for what I'm going to share with you today. I will be sharing results of a US consumer study that was conducted in 2023. And just to put it in context again, tourism obviously is a key driver and a vital component of economic growth for the Atlantic Canadian region. And like economies around the world, we've been profoundly impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. There certainly is very few sectors that have been more impacted than those within tourism. Thankfully, the industry appears to be rebounding, but at the end of the third year following post-pandemic, uh, there was interest in really understanding the factors that impact the way Americans travel and how they might be different going forward, given the ongoing, ever-changing post-pandemic dynamic. So, with that in mind, we were commissioned to conduct the U.S. consumer study that I'm going to share results of with you. I do want to say this project has been made possible through funding provided by the Atlantic Canada Agreement on Tourism, ACAT. And ACAT is a 9-member pan-Atlantic initiative comprised of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, or ACOA, the 4 Atlantic Canada Tourism Industry Associations, and the 4 provincial departments responsible for tourism. So, on that note, what I'd like to do today is share with you the results, but let me tell you a little bit about the methodology that was undertaken. This was an online survey, and it was an online survey with travelers from 2 regions, namely the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions of the United States. And I appreciate that for many of you, American travelers and this region may be only one of many important markets, but that's the focus of this study. When I say Mid-Atlantic, I'm referring to those living within New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And for reference, New England includes Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Vermont, and Rhode Island. We had just over 2,400 travelers complete the survey, an even mix between 1,200 within Mid-Atlantic and 1,200 in New England. And this, as I mentioned, was conducted towards the end of the summer last year, so between July 25th and August 1st of 2023. And on average, it took participants 22 minutes to complete the survey. So a pretty detailed survey, and we had much included within that study. There were several objectives of this study, and at a very high level, we wanted to understand the factors that currently impact the way that Americans travel. We also wanted to gain insight on how that may influence their travel intentions going forward and learn more about their behaviors and their destination choices over the short term. And we also wanted to explore visitor market potential from each of these 2 regions. Another, I'll say, secondary objective for this study was dealing with advertising. And we showed advertising campaigns for each Atlantic province in the ad. Thus, the ad was a little bit longer than typical ads. And today I'll be sharing with you the impact to the Nova Scotia tourism advertising campaign that we shared, as well as perceptions on that. Now, when I say travelers completed this survey, importantly, they had to pre-qualify to complete. In particular, everyone had to have a valid passport. So they had to at least be able to travel to Canada. Also, they have to have taken at least one vacation trip of at least 2 nights outside their home state during the past 3 years, with at least one night spent in paid accommodations, or have definite plans to take such a trip over the next year. We did not put quotas in place for age, gender, or within region or by segment. So this was very much focused on those who met those pre-qualifiers, people who were open to take a trip or were thinking about taking a trip. So what I'm going to do today is share highlights of this. Again, there is much information within the study, but we're going to talk about travel activities, what they consider when they're planning trip, how they plan their trip, what their travel intentions going forward are, and then also uh, I'll tell you a little bit about the reactions to advertising. So let's start with travel activities. What we saw is that literally all really US travelers, they've taken a recent out-of-state vacation. 94% said they've taken an out-of-state vacation trip in the past 3 years. And we see that the number of separate vacation trips varies across demographics. But on average, we've got the typical traveler taking 4 to 5 trips during that time. We see, not surprisingly, those with a higher household income, they're more likely to have taken more trips. And also, it increased with age. Domestic travel, clearly, though, is most common among US travelers. We asked them where are the top destinations that they've traveled in recent years, and you can see 3/4 say within the United States. So they're staying within their own country. Second to that, 27% have visited the Caribbean or Bermuda, 1/4 Canada, 2 and 10 Europe, and 14% Mexico. Now, when we look at where they're going when they visited within the United States, the top US destinations that come to mind here are Florida. But other than that, it's New York, Maine, and then California, but also New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. So you can see here that many of those destinations, they're pretty close to home. So aside from Florida and California, they're staying pretty close. Now, I mentioned here 27% or 24% rather have visited Canada. So when we look at those US travelers who have visited Canada in the past 3 years, what we see is that Ontario and Quebec are those areas that are most often visited. But when we look at those who have traveled to Canada, what percent rather have visited the Atlantic region, you can see here that New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are the two Atlantic provinces most likely to have been visited. So 13% told us that they visited the Atlantic region. And here, interestingly, when we look at that Nova Scotia visitation, the likelihood of visiting Nova Scotia actually increases with age. So it's 3%, for instance, for those 50 and up. We also wanted to know, so aside from whether they have visited in the past 3 years, have they ever visited Atlantic Canada? And this really helps for us to understand familiarity. And while we see that that Ontario and Quebec are the most common provinces that US travelers have visited, there has been a notable percentage that have visited Atlantic Canada. So keep in mind, I mentioned earlier that 13% said they visited Nova Scotia within the past 3 years, but 27%. So double that number have visited Nova Scotia ever. So there is some familiarity. Those who have not visited, a large percentage of those, 47 to 63%, and the 63% is actually Nova Scotia, have heard of each Atlantic province. We wanted to understand those who have visited at some point in the past, their level of familiarity. And when we look at the US travelers market overall, we see that, not surprisingly, awareness and familiarity is strongest for Ontario and Quebec. Again, not a surprise since those are the two areas that they visit most. Um, the bulk of US travelers, though, are aware of each Atlantic Canadian province. Those are the ones highlighted in green. And you can see awareness and familiarity among the four Atlantic provinces is highest for Nova Scotia. So across the population here, 73% said that they are aware, 45% say they're familiar. Now, those who expressed some level of familiarity with Nova Scotia, we wanted to ask them, what would you expect to find or to see and do if you visited Nova Scotia? And what we saw is very much centered around the ocean and nature and sightseeing as key expectations. Um, if I look at some of this, I'll say color commentary, just to give you an idea of what they told us. I'd go in the summer for lots of outdoor experiences and beautiful scenery. I do hiking, boating, uh, going to all the small restaurants for unusual cuisine. I go into antique shops and visit yard and estate sales looking for antiques. Lobsters and seafood. I'd enjoy the shoreline and lighthouse, Halifax waterfront, whale watching, and much more. Whale watching, Titanic Museum, hiking, beaches, Cape Breton Highlands National Park, and Lobster. I'd go to Cape Breton and drive or cycle the Cabot Trail and hike a few of the trails. Mining towns, scenic drives, historic villages. And finally, I'd expect a lot of outdoor activities and adventures such as hiking, biking, rafting, seeing historic sites, enjoying lots of great food and drink, and meeting many new, great, interesting people. So that gives you an idea of the expectations that they have of Nova Scotia if they have some level of familiarity with that, with the province. Now, we wanted to understand what impacts where they choose to go when they're traveling. And specifically, we presented 25 different items and said, how important are each of these 25 items to you when you're choosing a destination? And for each of those 25 items, and they ranged from all different categories, we asked whether it was critically important, important but not critical, or not at all important. Now, given that there are 25 of those, what I wanted to show you here is the factors that were most critical. And across the wide range of factors that we presented, we see that most important was safety in terms of what is deemed critically important when choosing a pleasure trip destination. So the top 10 factors, again, topping the list, 80% said it was critically important, is that the place is a safe place to visit. And all of these, think in terms of messaging, and if these items are critically important, how can you and your offer align with these critically important items? So you can see 2/3 say it needs to be a place I can enjoy when I travel with friends and family, a place that allows me to de-stress, a place with a lot of great things to do and see, offering good value for money. 62% said that's critically important. Other items, again, that top out the top 10. Um, it has beautiful outdoor scenery and landscapes, has people that are friendly and welcoming, has great local dining and culinary experiences, is a great place for exploring and soaking in the atmosphere, and is a place that offers a real, authentic experience. Virtually all of these were deemed important, but what makes these again so important is that these are the percentage that said it's critically important in their decision. At the other end of the spectrum, for instance, items that were least likely to be critically important were things like amusement parks or a nightlife. So these type of topics really, again, top the list. So we wondered, knowing what they look for, or what's important to them, we wanted to know what their intentions were when thinking about pleasure destinations for more than 2 nights in the next 2 years across 4 key markets. So specifically, we asked them what their intentions are to visit United States, Europe, Canada, or Mexico within the next 2 years. And when we look at these results, you can see that US travelers, their preference is clearly for domestic travel. And just in terms of interpreting this, what uh, there are three key areas rather that I'll point to. The gray is it's not interested to me, or I never thought of it. So not top of mind. The orange means that it's something that they might think about. It's dreaming about visiting or returning, or seriously considering visiting or returning there. But the blue is what I'll call active planning stages. They're in the process of gathering info, planning an itinerary, currently making arrangements, or they've already booked it. So obviously a key point here is that the blue area, 47%, so just about half, are currently and actively planning a trip within the United States. 23% are doing so in Europe, and we've got 2 in 10 who are currently in the active planning stage for Canada. Mexico is less likely at 11%. But importantly, here we see there's plenty of orange for Canada. And I point that out because obviously that's about half. And the place that we would not want to be is a bulk of gray, where it's not something that is of interest. We also asked for those who are looking to consider Canada, what their intentions are to visit Canada in the next 2 years. So keep in mind, those are the folks who indicated that they're actively planning. And what we see is we wanted to know where it is that they're likely to visit. And you can see here that of those who were actively planning, 19% are likely to visit Nova Scotia, and the likelihood to visit each Atlantic province varies slightly. So travelers, again, they're less likely to consider Canada as a destination, less likely to be in the active planning stage, but those who are, there is some interest in coming to Atlantic Canada, and especially Nova Scotia. So again, before they had seen any ads, we wanted to know whether they're likely to visit Atlantic Canada over the next 3 years. And here we see 63% of those say that they have some likelihood of considering travel to at least one Atlantic Canadian province in the next 2 years. When we break that down in terms of whether it be one or multiple provinces, 15% of those who are going to travel to Atlantic Canada would likely go to one Atlantic Canadian province, 17% likely 2, 13% 3, and 19% 4. However, not surprisingly, those who suggested that they'd like to go to all 4 Atlantic provinces, the likelihood or the familiarity that they have with the province tends to be lower with the region, suggesting that they may not be fully aware of the distance that's actually involved in traveling to all 4 provinces. Now, another area that's interesting is we looked at future travel intentions across a number of different vacation trips. Namely short trips of 1 to 2 nights, longer trips of 3 or more nights, trips within their own states, trips outside their home but within the US, and trips to Canada, as well as trips beyond the US and Canada. And here we see that, again, the bulk of US travelers anticipate that the number of vacation trips that they're going to take in the coming year will be the same or higher than in the previous year. And you can see here that for the most part, you've got in Canada 34% saying they're going to be taking the same number of trips. So they're most likely to mention that. But there is 2 in 10 who say they'll be taking more trips to Canada. Now, we asked them, assuming you have a choice of visiting Atlantic Canada, Mid-Atlantic, or New England, but you could only choose one of them, which would you choose? And overall, we see here that Atlantic Canada and New England are equally preferred regional destinations. So again, if they could only choose one of these 3 destinations, you can see 37% said New England, but 36% said they'd visit Atlantic Canada. We wanted to understand those who said Atlantic Canada of the 3 destinations, why? And what we heard is that they've heard good things, but most notably, they've never been. They want to go somewhere new and far from home, and they're familiar with the other areas, namely Mid-Atlantic and New England. So they want to experience something different. Um, to a lesser extent, the scenery, nature, wildlife, or I like the area, I enjoyed previous trips are mentioned. But by far, people chose Atlantic Canada because they want to go someplace different and someplace that's not home. When we looked at the visiting or the traveling intentions on this study, we wanted to provide a market potential idea. And we looked at the US Census figures and the survey qualification data to see what the market potential for Nova Scotia visitation might be across each of these markets, understanding that these are based on, a large population. When we look at the percent that's visited in the past year, the percent that plan to visit in the next 2 years, and those who would consider it in the future, you can see that there's great potential within the total population within the Mid-Atlantic and within the New England area. And obviously the Mid-Atlantic appears to provide more potential because of its larger population. So that's where the potential or where the census figures come into play here. So clearly it shows that there is potential there. We wanted to talk about or understand travel planning. And we were especially interested in exploring the pleasure trip planning cycle. And what we saw is that June to September are considered peak travel months for an Atlantic Canadian vacation, and potential visitors, when they start their planning cycle, it usually lasts several months. So a few things that are important to point out here. We asked what month they're likely to consider visiting Atlantic Canada, and you can see again, June, July, August, and September are the peak seasons. Importantly, results are very consistent regardless of which province within Atlantic Canada we're speaking of. Also, when you consider the average months to plan, to research, and to book, you can see that again, very consistent. And in Nova Scotia, it's 4.8 in terms of the number of months to plan or research, and 3.7 months notice before they book. So overall, when you look at the region, planning, think of 4 to 5 months, and booking, think of 3 to 4 months as a guide. We also asked to what extent, where they actually turned rather for information for Atlantic Canada. And here we see that travel-related websites and review sites are key sources for information when they're considering an Atlantic Canadian vacation. So 62% said they turn to travel websites like Expedia or Travelocity. More than half said they look for online review sites. Destination websites are mentioned by 38%, social media, 36%, and 1/3 rely on advice of family and friends. So many different information sources that are relied on, but these are the top 5. Another important point when considering travel planning is how they're traveling. And we see here that air travel is the most common anticipated mode of transportation to Atlantic Canada for vacation. Interestingly, we wanted to know these are those who are likely to consider travel to Atlantic Canada, regardless of whether they've been or not before, but how they get there. And you can see that by far, air is most often mentioned. In Nova Scotia, it varies slightly for Nova Scotia, depending on whether Mid-Atlantic or New England, which isn't surprising. So you can see a slightly higher percentage of those who are inclined to drive if they're in New England. So it's a little bit closer versus those who would fly. They're more likely to be in the Mid-Atlantic area. So for Nova Scotia, we've got 17% that mention ferry. So interestingly, though, air is the most common anticipated mode of transportation. From a travel perspective, we also wanted to understand, do they look for assistance in booking their trip to assist with their planning? And of those who told us they're likely to consider visiting Atlantic Canada within the next 2 years, you can see that more than half, between 55% and 59%, depending on the province, tell us they'd use a travel agent or a tour operator. So really it's quite consistent regardless of which Atlantic province we're talking about. And when we asked what they look for assistance on, booking air transportation, asking for recommendations, booking accommodations, those are key, as well as booking a package, including transportation, accommodation, meals, etc. Less inclined to look for assistance for booking car rentals, booking a cruise, booking ferries. Um, um, so clearly they are likely to use the assistance of someone to help. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a real person. It could be an online service, obviously. So after we talked about their travel planning and their travel intentions, we wanted to understand what they recalled seeing or hearing in terms of advertising for Atlantic Canada. And we see that exposure to Atlantic Canada tourism advertising is strong. And US travelers have been exposed through a variety of different advertising mediums. So in the Mid-Atlantic, 56% said they have seen advertising for Atlantic Canada. And you can see that's strongest in Nova Scotia at 50%. In New England, it's 48% have seen some type of advertising. And once again, you can see that Nova Scotia has the highest recall there at 53%. Now, when we wanted to understand where they're seeing the advertising, the mediums that are generally recalled are a mix. 20% said television, 20% said social media, and a similar percent said online, just generally. So mixed mode, but they're seeing advertising in multiple different places. So then for each of the Atlantic provinces, we showed a video and some static imagery of a tourism campaign. Today, I'm just going to be sharing with you reactions to the Nova Scotia ads. And what we saw is that the ads were largely considered appealing and motivating. So they watched the video. We showed them some different images, social media and static imagery, and we heard that the bulk, 71%, consider these ads, this campaign, to be appealing. And 64% said it motivates them to travel to Nova Scotia. So it had an impact. The Nova Scotia ads, they showcase for them the proximity to the ocean and Nova Scotia's place as Canada's essential seacoast destination. So we presented a series of statements and said, to what extent do you agree or disagree with each of these statements? And you can see strong agreement. So this campaign was well received. 3/4 said that the campaign shows that in Nova Scotia, you'll never be far from the ocean or its influence. 68% said it shows that Nova Scotia is Canada's essential seacoast destination. 64% said it includes things of interest to me, and 63% makes them want to find out more about Nova Scotia. So very positive. Ultimately, though, we wanted to know if it's going to have any impact on travel intentions. And what we saw is that the advertising positively influences travel intentions to Nova Scotia. In fact, after going through the campaign, 49% said they're likely to consider taking a pleasure trip to Nova Scotia after seeing the ads. Keep in mind, that's compared to the 19% before seeing the ads that told us that they're likely to visit Nova Scotia. So clearly had an impact on their consideration. We also wanted to know, finally, again, the exposure, the impact that it has and likelihood to visit Atlantic Canada. So after seeing the ads for all 4 Atlantic provinces, 68% of US travelers told us that they have some likelihood to travel to at least one Atlantic Canada province in the next 2 years. And that was 63% who expressed some likelihood to consider traveling to at least one Atlantic Canadian province pre-ad. So the important takeaway here is that the campaigns collectively made a difference. The campaigns had different levels of impact, and the Nova Scotia one clearly had a very positive impact. And the likelihood to visit Atlantic Canada, when we break that down by the number of provinces, 14% likely to go to one province, 18% said 2, 12% 3, and 1/4 say they're likely to go to all 4 provinces. So again, advertising clearly has made a difference. So with all of this being said, there are really 6 key points here that suggests there's a need for consideration on these points. The first one is that US travelers are generally open to a wide variety of destination choices. We know that they like to travel, they like to stay close to home, and Atlantic Canada holds appeal to many. We also know that, again, related to that, proximity plays a key role in destination choice. So those proximity between New England and Atlantic Canada really plays a key role in destination choice. And those living in New England are most likely to consider visiting Nova Scotia even. So the closer they are, the better. We also know that past experience in Atlantic Canada clearly impacts travel intentions. So those who have been before showed a greater inclination to consider returning or to visiting Atlantic Canada. Clearly, these findings show that Atlantic Canada does face tough competition when looking at the US market, particularly the US domestic travel and travel to Ontario and Quebec. That's close to home again, given that they like that proximity and with a relatively limited awareness of and familiarity with the region and its offerings, that presents a challenge when you're looking to attract US travelers. So they need to become aware of the region's unique and varied offerings. We know that they're looking for something that's different from home. And at the same time, when they see the advertising of what the region offers, it truly does make a difference. So awareness impacts intentions. When you consider media buys, and this is probably something that is not at all new to you, but future campaign efforts, it should focus on media buys in the early winter and the spring months. And that's primarily because of the planning cycle that is required or common for the US traveler. um, this point here talks about differentiation, and it's so important. They want something that's different from what they have at home. So differentiation plays a key role in encouraging U.S. travelers to select an Atlantic Canadian pleasure trip over other destination choices, especially those within that local domestic market. But one point that is so important here is considering affordability. And this is where we need to think about the potential impact of the exchange rate now. That works in our favor. So we know that 6 in 10 said affordability is critically important to them. So differentiation, while considering affordability, is important for those within the tourism sector. And the final point I'll mention relates to air access, and certainly within the region. And this is a direct outcome of the pandemic. There certainly have been challenges in terms of access to air travel, but given the interest of air travel as a way to access Atlantic Canada, findings certainly suggest rather that an air travel access solution is needed to meet the U.S. travelers' needs. And that obviously has to be one that is affordable for them and accessible. So that's the results. So at a high level, again, I realize that I've shared much information with you today. Now, if you have any questions, I'd certainly be happy to hear them. Okay, we have from Anna, based on the research, what aspects of Nova Scotia do you think visitors from the northeastern US states would enjoy the most? Um, Clearly, great question. And this comes back to what their expectations are and what their desires are. They want something that's different from home. So we don't want to sell them or promote things that are identical to what they have at home, but they want the access to the water. They want the to experience something different. They also want to experience the people and the food. So it's seeing things that are different from home, and that's the experience and the culture, and again, the food. Any other questions? Call, Joanne mentioned that flights are returning in a strong way and more frequently and longer into the fall. So definitely, the air industry obviously took a major hit during the pandemic. It's great to see that they are returning, particularly in that U.S. Uh, market, and that obviously will have a great impact. Hopefully a very positive impact on the likelihood of U.S. travelers to actually visit this region and choose Atlantic Canada. Another question is, what's the percentage visiting Ontario and Quebec in comparison to Atlantic? And you'll recall that I said that it's Ontario and Quebec that they visit most often. And you'll recall also that I said about a quarter, so 24% said they were coming to Atlantic Canada. Well, Ontario, if you think of that, those in the mid-Atlantic, 52% indicated that they visited Ontario, versus 33% said Quebec, those of those who are traveling to Canada. So notably higher than visiting Atlantic Canada. Quebec, those New England, 43%. Visited Quebec, 33% mid-Atlantic. And again, what those results are showing, aside from obviously the higher level of visitation than Atlantic Canada, is that proximity matters. So Ontario being most inclined to go to the mid-Atlantic, and Quebec, New England. So great question. And Adam has asked, what do you think caused the difference between considering a trip to Nova Scotia pre and post ad and considering visitation at least one province pre and post ad? Um, I think much of it is the level of familiarity that they actually have with Atlantic Canada. And I mean, it's subjective for myself, obviously, but when they see the advertising, their level of familiarity or awareness increases in terms of what they could actually expect to see or do. So it's positively influencing their likelihood to visit. Again, increasing that familiarity certainly improves visiting intentions. And Anna mentioned in the chat, not a question, obviously, but a comment. It's great to see. She loves seeing how well Nova Scotia performs in terms of familiarity and interest in visiting. And I think from a Nova Scotia tourism perspective, Anna, it certainly would be reassuring to see how very positive the campaign was received and how it appears to very much influence visiting intentions positively. And some thumbs up in terms of the ad campaign. Colleen asked about the age breakdown of respondents, and we did see that there is a variance here by age in some opinions, and I talked about that. 28% of all those we surveyed were between the ages of 55 and 75. 35% were between 35 and 54, and 38% were between 18 and 34. So we had a great mix of age groups. And if anyone else would like to share, again, you can unmute your line and share verbally or continue to send through chats. But thank you for those comments.
Hi, guys. I had one question. Bob Aducci, I'm with the Cat Ferry. We notice a trend of folks booking relatively close into their travel date. And I wondered about the timing of the campaigns, late winter and spring. I know in New England, if we have a lousy spring, I mean, we've had snow as late as April, and I think people are not thinking summer travel until closer when kids get out of school and so forth. And I'm just wondering if there's been ever any consideration. I always feel like and I see the campaigns. I've been in this market for a long time. I was 11 years with Ontario Ministry of Tourism here in Boston. So I pay a lot of attention to the advertising. I feel like it's in some cases maybe early in terms of the timing, just because the trend seems to be people booking closer into the travel date. And then the other thing is just a general comment. We do a lot of consumer shows. We do the huge travel show in New York. There are 24,000 people there. So we get a real good gut check talking to people one-on-one in terms of their familiarity with the destination and so forth. And a lot of people, I think there's a big impediment to travel in terms of access. A lot of folks just don't have any sense of geography. We have a huge Nova Scotia map where we explain what the distances are from Yarmouth to Halifax, or if folks want to go all the way to Cape Breton and so forth. So, I don't know what the best way to overcome that is, but I find generally, unfortunately, Americans don't have a good sense of geography. And I wonder if there's a way in the advertising to counter some of that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I don't know if someone from the industry, Anna, whether you'd want to comment on that. But certainly we have seen that familiarity is maybe limited in terms of geographic. You're right, Bob. Anna?
Thank you, Margaret. I just wanted to point out that Tourism Nova Scotia's Chief Marketing Officer just posted some information with respect to when our Northeastern US campaigns run. And they do run all the way through to August. Just to address that question around, do they stop in spring? Absolutely not, because we know that there's a distribution of planning times. The average may be 4 to 5 months, but we know that there's a group of people who book well in advance, and then there's also a group of people who make their travel decisions and bookings and final plans closer to when they actually travel. So we do make sure we cover that with our campaigns. And I
Thanks,
know
Anna.
on just one other point on terms of getting here, I know on novascotia.com, and I know we got some other marketing folk on the call as well, but the how to get here information is also explained very well on the Tourism Nova Scotia website.
Yeah, I know there's a link on the Tourism Nova Scotia website that maps out 3-day itineraries, 5-day, and I use that a lot for folks that I feel might not have a good sense of, or have the wherewithal to strategically plan a multi-day trip. So that information on the site is wonderful.
And Bob, I will mention too, the 4 to 5 months or 3 to 4 months to book. I mean, those are general averages. Certainly there are outliers on either end, take longer and much shorter time frames too. These are just the high level averages that I presented. And Joanne, I saw you unmuted, so if you'd like to share something.
Anna just reiterated what I had posted there. I just wanted to speak additionally to the helping people understand the geography. That is something that just takes over time. And what happens is our job is to entice them to find out more. So with our campaigns, we try to, really inspire people and say, hey, this is something of interest to you, which clearly it is once we see the research of the number percentage that really it does speak to them. And then once they do that, they're looking, their next action generally is to find out more. And that's where they can start to figure out how to get here, which is where novascotia.com is so important with all its ways of helping people understand they can fly and drive to get here and understand the geography. But that is only going to happen over time. And the more we talk to it, it only works for the people that are interested. So that's our main goal, is to really help those people that are truly interested in coming to Nova Scotia once they learn about us. So, but it takes time, and it also takes, working with the travel trade industry. In the US, it's not as popular as it is in UK and Germany, for example. But there are travel trade pieces and marketplaces and media that we also work with in the US that help pass along that message as well. And that's throughout the year.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Colleen, shall I pass it back to you?
Certainly. If there's no other questions, then I would just like to thank everyone for joining. A reminder that we will have the copy of the presentation and recording shortly on the ACAT website, which will be through the URL you see in the chat. And thanks again. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation and found the information useful. Thanks again, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye now.